Cat Person is a story captivated everyone, so I'm sure everyone has been asking you what brought you into the story already. But for you, the magic of Cat Person is something that is kind of hard to replicate. So what were the things that you were looking to bring into your version of Cat Person that the original short story kind of had? Like what were those moments that you were trying to like still keep true to your version of this?
Yeah, well, no, that's a good question because the story is kind of perfect as is, and in many ways, it's Kristen wrote an amazing story that, obviously everyone reacted very, very strongly to it. A lot of people, loved it, and some people, I've become friends with her as she'll be the first to tell you, a lot of people really got angry about it. um, so yeah, so it's a great story. So why even bother adapting it? So I will say this: when someone came to me and said, "We have the rights. Do you want to adapt it?" And I read it, and I, like everyone, was captivated by it. And I thought, wow, it's touching into so many interesting things. The two things that kind of stuck out to me in terms of, well, what could you possibly bring to an adaptation, and how would you do it? One was the fact that I really felt there was a bubbling kind of horror story underneath that it felt like a horror story to me, not one that's fully realized, but that element was certainly bubbling underneath the story. It turns out it was supposed to be part of a collection of stories that were horror stories that Kristen was writing. So she also, I think, sort of saw it that way, although it's really not on the page that way. But there's a real sense of dread. So I thought that would be interesting to bring out, because I do think horror is one of the best genres to tackle societal kind of issues, burning kind of things that everyone's talking about. And certainly what was going on, this is pre-Me Too, um, you know, certainly all this was bubbling underneath the surface. So I thought horror is really good uh, genre, and maybe this is a good way to tackle this material. And then the other thing is, I felt like that the end of the story is the word whore. And I felt like, huh, that's interesting. She meant it as an ending, meaning that we've made now a decision about Robert. And I thought, one of the things, obviously, I was writing and this after the Me Too thing had exploded. So I started to think, well, the conversation's a little more complicated than that. And I thought, in a weird way, that the way the story ended is maybe not the end of the conversation. So I thought, I think there's more to be said here also. I think her story is perfect and did exactly what it needed to do. But I also felt like, the conversation can continue. And that was always the idea.
Yeah, and I think too, it is different enough that it is still captivating because I know so many of us were just instantly obsessed that with a movie version of Cat Person, it's like, well, how are we still going to find that like captivating nature in a story that we know so well? Were you ever worried about making it something completely its own? Or did you just know that you wanted to still have its own voice in the midst of still being an adaptation of the short story?
Well, it's always interesting when you're adapting something. You have to ask yourself, why are you adapting it? And the story's just very, very good. So it didn't make any sense to me to just throw it out and just kind of use it as a vague template. It's wonderful. And so I thought, well, let's use a lot of it. It was just the idea of growing the story further beyond, the end of the story, and saying like, well, wait a minute, maybe that's not the last word. So I felt I wanted to honor what Kristen had written, and so a lot of her stuff is in there, and a lot of her ideas and everything, and I felt that that was the right way to go. I didn't feel like I needed to just throw the baby out and the bathwater and just make it something to, because what would be the point? I could just go write something different. So I thought bringing her story into it was a good idea.
Yeah, and
Because
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, no, go ahead.
No, and I also too, I think the tone of this movie is very important because it's very eerie throughout the whole thing in a way that like while you're reading the story, it is eerie, especially in the way that she describes Robert and things like that. But it sits with you in a very different place, especially like for me at least.
Oh,
Watching
good.
it sit differently than it did when I was reading it. When you were writing it, was that ever intentional of like you trying to like find it like its own tone, or was it just like coming from you and how you were writing it to be a perspective that is just slightly different?
Well, no, the tone, of course, was really important, and it was tricky because you you want to feel the dread all along because if you're going to sort of give yourself over to a genre, a lot of times, I mean, you need to pay attention to what works in those genres. So, I mean, every sometimes you can break the rules entirely, but I in this case I felt like it's important to know that something is amiss from the very, very beginning. And that has a lot to do with how women live in their imaginations, and how they live in their imaginations differently than men, of course, because women, by virtue of being, physically smaller and less strong, just by nature, have a tendency to feel more vulnerable to any kind of confrontation, or so this notion of carrying around, it's just like the how women walk through an empty parking lot at night, and there's just women carry with them sort of an imprinted vigilance, because you never know kind of what's out there. And I think a lot of women can relate to that, and that was really the notion of bringing that sort of feeling into the dating world. Seemed really interesting to me.
And two, I talked to you for Operation Mincemeat in the
Oh,
past.
right.
I think is there for you is there a we talked about adaptation already, but is there a limitation or is there an excitement for you with adaptation? Because I like sometimes what someone else might see as a limitation is an excitement for a writer because it's like, no, that's a challenge.
Right.
You're you're subverting expectations, but someone else might be like, no, I now I have a chat like now that's someone else's vision that I have to like try and like poke at. But how do you kind of like approach that as a creative? Is it like daunting or are you just like excited to step up to that challenge?
Usually both. Usually both. Like, for example, with Mincemeat, it's based on a huge book that has a massive amount of information in it. So that was daunting, but it's also really exciting because I love the book. So I usually feel both. And I felt that with this. I felt like, oh, the story's so beloved, the story's so good. So that's a challenge in a scary way. But I also felt excited because I love the material. The only thing not to do is adapt stuff that you don't like. Then you're in trouble. So, but usually I feel exactly both. I feel both. Wow, this is a big responsibility, and I'm really excited.
And this too, like I think part of the excitement about this is it's like these are two actors as well that like fans kind of enjoy watching.
Right,
So it's like a weird, it's like, oh, we always pictured like Robert especially in a certain way when thinking about Cat Person, and then it's like, oh, but that's cousin Greg. So like
right.
that's a little different for us when you obviously like when you're writing a screenplay, you don't necessarily like dreamcast people, but like did you envision especially a character like Robert in a particular way when you were writing him versus like maybe like when you were reading Cat Person for the first time?
Well, of course, Kristen really describes him in his story, so you do have an image. So yeah, I mean, this is the difference about between a story and something on film. You got to make it real. So when we were talking about casting, yes, we talked endlessly, endlessly, endlessly about Robert, like who would that be? And there was all sorts of ideas tossed around, and like Zach Efron. I mean, we're just like, what? So crazy stuff. So we felt that Nick actually had that perfect mix of kind of, you know, not totally confident, like there's something sort of vulnerable about him, that he seemed to for us like perfect. He seemed absolutely perfect. And even the fact that that cousin Greg character is has similar qualities, kind of. We just thought, this is a really good. It was hard though. It was really hard to cast that role. Very, very hard.
And it works though, because it's like the looming too, because he's so tall. It really like
Exactly.
the
He's
looming of him
Yeah. Well,
really.
again, and that sort of plays into that very sort of primitive kind of, do I need to be afraid of this person? I mean, he is really tall, and so it's a little like, he could be scary, I guess, so that's the thing we really wanted to play with.
Yeah, and it too is just like it leaves you in a similar way of like the way that Horror did in the story, leaves you in a way that you're like, oh, I'm gonna be thinking about this version of the story's ending for a long while. And so for you, what do you hope audiences take away when they get to see this take on Cat Person?
I hope that people look at it and say, they they're they were not communicating. That is a perfect example of two human beings that, with all the putting up false fronts, with all their devices, with all that they actually didn't communicate honestly until it was way too late, until really there was sort of no way out for both of them. And the notion that it's in the actual communicating where things can improve between people. I mean, that the real breakdown happens when people are not being honest, communicative, saying their truth. It's funny, when I got done with that story, I thought, wow, if women would speak their truth more often and men would listen, maybe things would be better.
Mhm.
And so I thought it would be really interesting to tell a story like that. I think what you're looking at is two people had many, many opportunities to actually communicate honestly with one another and missed them all.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Thank you so much for talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel. Lovely to talk to you.
Have a great one.
Bye.
Bye.